But I go, can I just try another one? That moment comes and I just go, this is Sparta!
For nearly 2 decades, audiences have watched Gerard Butler roar "This is Sparta" and kick an unfortunate messenger into a bottomless well. It's one of the most quoted, most parodied, most endlessly replayed moments in modern action cinema. But behind that single iconic frame sits a production so grueling, so physically punishing, that even the actors who lived through it needed years before they could talk about it honestly. Gerard Butler has spent the better part of 2 decades doing exactly that, dropping pieces of the real story in interviews, documentaries, and late-night appearances, slowly assembling a picture that's far darker and far more human than the marble-cut mythology on screen. Today, we're putting those pieces together. This is the story fans never fully got, not the legend of Leonidas, but the story of the man who nearly broke himself trying to become him. When 300 arrived in theaters in March 2007, nobody in Hollywood was fully prepared for what happened next. Zack Snyder, a director with only one previous studio film to his name, had taken Frank Miller's stark, blood-red graphic novel and turned it into something audiences had never quite seen, a film shot almost entirely against blue screens, drenched in desaturated color and slow-motion violence, following 300 Spartan soldiers to their deaths at Thermopylae. Studios treated it as a gamble. There were no A-list stars carrying the marquee, no sweeping historical romance, no easy comparison point. What it had instead was audacity. That audacity paid off almost instantly. The film opened to a stunning debut weekend, pulling in tens of millions more than most executives had projected. And it kept climbing from there, eventually crossing well past $400 million worldwide against a budget that was modest by blockbuster standards. It became a cultural event as much as a box office one, spawning endless internet memes, a viral catchphrase, and a workout craze that spilled out of gyms and into mainstream fitness magazines. But none of the headlines about box office records or cultural buzz captured what it actually took to get those bodies, those battles, and that voice onto the screen. That story stayed largely hidden for years, tucked behind Gerard Butler's easy, self-deprecating charm in interviews, until slowly he began letting the mask slip. Ask Gerard Butler about the 300 set today, and one memory keeps resurfacing before almost anything else: the ambulance. Not literally every day, but often enough that it became a grim rhythm of production. Someone getting hurt, someone getting carted off to be checked out, someone showing up the next morning anyway, bandaged and back in armor. Butler has described watching a spear come within inches of a fellow actor's eye during a fight sequence, and recalling another performer going down hard enough to break bones during a stunt gone wrong. These weren't isolated freak accidents. They were symptoms of a production built around genuine physical risk. Part of the reason injuries piled up was a deliberate choice Snyder made early on. Rather than leaning heavily on stunt doubles for the film's constant barrage of combat, he wanted his actors doing as much of the fighting themselves as possible, because it read differently on camera, more visceral, more convincing, more alive. That decision gave 300 its distinctive kinetic energy, but it also meant that the men playing Spartan soldiers were absorbing real physical punishment, take after take, in heavy costume pieces, on hard studio floors, surrounded by blue screen walls, with no natural light and precious little room to maneuver. Weapons were blunted for safety, but blunted isn't the same as harmless when you're swinging metal at speed dozens of times a day. Bruises were constant. Cuts were routine. Nobody walked off that set clean. What made it harder still was the nature of the shoot itself. Because so much of the world of Sparta was going to be painted in digitally after the fact, the actors were often fighting against nothing, swinging swords at empty air, reacting to enemies who existed only in Snyder's storyboards and their own imaginations. That kind of performance takes a strange, specific kind of stamina. Physical exhaustion layered on top of the mental effort of pretending convincingly that you're fending off an invading army in a warehouse in Montreal. Butler has said that by the end of most days, he felt completely wrung out, not just sore but genuinely depleted, in a way that ordinary film shoots rarely produce. The armor came off, but the exhaustion didn't. The punishment didn't start when the cameras rolled. It started months earlier, in a gym, under a trainer who had no interest in making his job easy. Long before 300 began principal photography, Butler and much of the ensemble were funneled into an intense, months-long training program designed to turn ordinary actors into something resembling ancient warriors. The regimen blended heavy strength work, brutal circuit training, and repetitive combat drills, all overseen by a trainer known for pushing clients well past their comfort zones. Sessions reportedly stretched for hours at a stretch, day after day, for the better part of 7 months in Butler's case, as he worked to physically transform himself into a believable Spartan king. The training wasn't just about looking imposing for the camera, although that mattered enormously given how little the film's costuming would cover. It was about building functional power, the kind of strength that could carry an actor through take after take of demanding stunt choreography without collapsing. Cast members flipped heavy tires, hoisted kettlebells, sprinted through punishing circuits, and ground out set after set of pull-ups and push-ups until their bodies simply couldn't do another rep. Combat drills were repeated relentlessly, blending choreography with functional movement until the fight sequences felt less like performance and more like muscle memory. It came at a real cost. Butler has spoken candidly about how close the training came to genuinely breaking his body. Chronic joint pain, tendon problems, and a shoulder injury that at one point left him barely able to lift his arms overhead. He's described the process, bluntly, as something that was actively wrecking him even as it was making him look like a warrior carved from stone. And the training didn't stop once filming began. Long shooting days were regularly followed by additional workouts, because the physique the film demanded had to be maintained shot after shot, week after week, with no real off-ramp until production wrapped. It became, in his own words, a cycle that never fully let up. Pain feeding intensity, intensity feeding the performance, and the performance demanding still more pain in return. The training regimen the cast followed eventually took on a life of its own outside the film. Trimmed down into an 8-week program built around high-repetition circuits and brutal conditioning work, it spread across gyms and fitness communities long after the movie left theaters, becoming something amateur athletes attempted to test themselves against, usually, by most accounts, without much success. For Butler, the physical transformation was only half the job. He's talked about the process of preparing for Leonidas as something closer to a mental and even spiritual undertaking than a conventional acting exercise. He described trying to meditate his way into the character's headspace, attempting to genuinely access what it might feel like to be a man who would knowingly lead a small band of soldiers to certain death for the sake of something larger than himself. It wasn't enough, in his mind, to simply perform confidence and command on camera. He wanted to actually feel the weight of that kind of leadership, even if only for the length of a shooting day. That commitment extended into his insistence on performing the vast majority of his own stunts, despite the very real physical danger that came with it. For Butler, doing the action himself wasn't about proving something to the studio or padding out a highlight reel. It was about honoring what the role represented. He's since described certain battle sequences as producing some of the most intense adrenaline highs of his career, moments where the physical exertion and the emotional stakes of the scene seemed to merge into something he couldn't have faked from a safer distance. That willingness to throw himself into danger wasn't unique to 300. It became something of a pattern throughout his career. He's spoken about enduring hypothermia while filming on location in Iceland years later, and about white-knuckle moments during explosive stunt sequences on other productions. But 300 was where that instinct first crystallized on a massive stage, and it shaped how he approached physical roles for years afterward. Complicating the performance, further, was just how little of the film's visceral violence existed physically on set. The vast majority of the blood, gore, and combat carnage was added digitally in post-production, meaning the actors had almost nothing tangible to react to in the moment. There were no blood packets rigging up practical splatter, no elaborate prosthetic wounds to sell the horror of battle. Butler and his co-stars had to summon the chaos of war purely through imagination, reacting to violence that, on the day, simply wasn't there. It demanded a strange kind of discipline, staying emotionally locked into brutal, high-stakes combat while physically surrounded by nothing but blue fabric and studio lighting rigs. Zack Snyder's ambition for 300 was to translate Frank Miller's graphic novel to the screen with almost obsessive fidelity, recreating individual panels shot for shot wherever possible. Achieving that vision meant leaning overwhelmingly on visual effects. By some estimates, the vast majority of the film's shots involved significant digital work. Rather than constructing sprawling physical sets or traveling to real historical locations, the production built its entire world inside a single studio space in Montreal, using extensive blue screen work to conjure the cliffs of Thermopylae and the throne rooms of Sparta entirely in post-production. That approach gave Snyder near total control over the finished look of the film. The lighting, the color grading, the atmosphere could all be sculpted digitally after the fact. But it also created a genuinely brutal physical environment for the people actually standing on set. The intense artificial lighting needed to achieve the film's signature high contrast. Glowing aesthetic pumped enormous heat into an already cramped studio space. Actors performed demanding fight choreography for hours at a stretch, while wearing heavy costume pieces under lights hot enough to make the whole set feel like an oven. Butler has said he passed out at one point during filming, a combination of dehydration and sheer physical overexertion catching up with him mid-shoot. It's a detail that rarely made it into the glossy behind-the-scenes features at the time, but it says a great deal about just how demanding those conditions actually were. Even the film's more surreal creative choices grew out of that pressure cooker environment. Certain sequences, like the Oracle's eerie, dreamlike dialogue, leaned heavily on improvisation rather than tightly scripted lines, part of an effort to preserve a mythic, unsettling tone that pure historical accuracy would have flattened. Snyder wasn't interested in a documentary-style retelling of Thermopylae. He wanted legend, and legend required bending reality wherever the story demanded it. The film's visual approach also fed directly back into that fitness phenomenon that outlived the movie itself. Because so little of the actors' bodies were covered by costume, the physiques on display became inseparable from the film's identity, and the workout regimen behind them, often circulated informally as the 300 workout, became genuinely notorious. Built around a brutal single continuous set of exercises without rest, it reportedly proved so demanding that only a small handful of people connected to the production could actually finish it as designed. Butler himself has admitted he was too physically drained to resume any serious training for well over a year after the shoot wrapped. Amid all that physical punishment, something else was quietly taking shape among the cast. A genuine bond forged less through rehearsal and more through shared suffering. Butler has spoken about how central that sense of unity became to selling the illusion of a lifelong brotherhood of soldiers on screen. The ensemble, which included Lena Headey, David Wenham, Dominic West, and a then-rising Michael Fassbender, spent months training alongside one another before filming even began, absorbing the same brutal circuits, the same aching muscles, the same exhaustion. That shared physical ordeal did something rehearsal alone couldn't have. By the time cameras rolled, the cast had already developed an unspoken familiarity with one another's limits and strengths, the kind of trust that's difficult to manufacture through blocking and line readings alone. Butler has described it as feeling, by the start of production, like they'd already been through something like war together, which made the fictional bond between Spartan soldiers feel less like performance and more like an extension of something real. That camaraderie extended well past the training room, carrying them through the shared misery of stifling studio heat, isolating blue screen environments, and the strange psychological toll of performing intense emotion against nothing but empty backdrops. The cultural footprint 300 left behind went far beyond a strong opening weekend. Its stark visual language, high-contrast color grading, digitally amplified slow motion, dramatic silhouettes against blown-out skies, became an aesthetic shorthand that other productions borrowed from for years afterward, showing up in everything from historical dramas to prestige television. It helped normalize the idea that a stylized graphic novel sensibility could carry a massive mainstream audience, paving the way for bigger visual swings across the industry. Its influence on fitness culture proved just as durable. The Spartan physique became a widely referenced benchmark almost overnight, discussed in gyms and fitness magazines well outside the usual bodybuilding circles, and it fed into broader, occasionally uncomfortable conversations about body image expectations for men. The film's most quotable line became a genuine piece of internet vernacular, endlessly remixed and reused far beyond its original context, cementing 300 as a permanent fixture of 2000s pop culture rather than a film that simply came and went. It even nudged people back toward the history it was loosely inspired by, prompting a wave of renewed public curiosity about the actual Battle of Thermopylae, even as historians were quick and largely correct to point out how loosely the film treated historical accuracy in service of its mythic tone. Before 300, Gerard Butler was a working actor with a handful of notable credits, but no defining role. A strong turn in The Phantom of the Opera, supporting parts in films like Reign of Fire, nothing that had made him a household name. Leonidas changed that almost instantly. The physical intensity he brought to the role, paired with the sheer conviction in his voice and presence, turned him overnight into one of the industry's most in-demand leading men. What followed was a career built on range as much as muscle. He moved into romantic territory with P.S. I Love You, leaned back into crime and action with projects like Rock'n'Rolla and Law-Abiding Citizen, found comedic footing in films like The Ugly Truth, and eventually built an entire action franchise around the Fallen series. Through it all, the through line back to 300 never really disappeared. The willingness to physically commit to a role, to absorb real risk in pursuit of authenticity, became something close to a signature. Looking back now, with the injuries healed and the story finally told in his own words, what stands out isn't just the impressive box office numbers or the meme-worthy catchphrase. It's the sheer scale of what it cost to make it, the hospital visits, the shoulder that could barely lift, the collapse from dehydration under studio lights, the year it took his body to recover afterward. Butler didn't just play a Spartan king. For 7 punishing months and a grueling shoot beyond that, he lived something close to the character's own philosophy, that anything worth achieving demands real sacrifice. Fans saw the legend. It's taken years for them to finally see what it actually cost to build it. What do you make of everything Gerard Butler went through to bring Leonidas to life? Does knowing the real story behind the